Okay guys, so in this second part of testing with React and Redux and all that good stuff, we're going to have a look at end-to-end tests, and I will touch on a little bit basically why I think it's important that we approach testing from multiple layers and not just from the component layer. So let's get into it. So in the last video we were kind of going into the whole discussion about, okay, first and foremost, what type of testing and like how granular do we kind of want to be here. So if you have a standard component, we want to be really granular, like test all the things pretty much, and on the bigger components you may not need to be that granular, and on because they're basically composed of smaller components, and those should also have their own tests if they're standard, right? But if we are actually going to go that route and we're actually going to test every component, then it makes a lot of sense to make this separation where you have a component layer which is just easy to render out, and then you have a container layer where you have most of your business logic and your impurities and so forth, because if you do it that way it becomes very easy for you to stub and mark off all of the impurities and also just test the actual rendering of the DOM, right? Now, last we checked, we had a bit of a look at the logging page here. And if we have a look at this container here, let's just look at this. So this is, at first glance, you may think that this is pretty much the same thing as the to-do list that we checked out in the last video, if we have a little bit of a look here. So it's the difference here is that, of course, we have this higher order component that passes in the fetch function, and we have some network calls and some dispatches and some other good stuff here, right? Now, there is one thing that we aren't really addressing here, that we are addressing here, or that we're facing here. And it is this. That line right there. This line right here is one of the main reasons as to why it is vital that you actually consider end-to-end tests the most important part of your application. Why? Well, because when you are testing this component, you have basically stated that up until, well, pretty much all the way up until here to this network call here, you are in the green. Like, you're basically just asserting that all of these things has happened, right? But even when you get to this line here, you have made an inference about the way that the server works. And that is a problem. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because this test has no guarantees whatsoever that this is actually working, that the server will actually behave this way when it's actually happening. This is the same limitation we have here. So when I'm getting this fetch, this is fairly straightforward because it doesn't return anything, but this thing here, what guarantees do I have that the thing that's going to come back is actually a list of to-dos? How do I know what the shape of those to-dos are going to be? Because in my test, it's just assuming that that list is going to be a list of strings, right? And that is a problem because I don't know. And if I don't have a test that checks this, or if I go myself and like click and stuff like that, if anything changes on the server, I'm kind of screwed. This test does nothing. All it does is that it asserts that some fake data that is coming from a fake system that I've basically stubbed and marked off here is actually going to return the thing that I want. And short of me literally running the entire system, there is no way for me to know what's going to happen. I can just fix it once, manually test it, and then just save my code and store it and hope that this is going to stay the way it will, but I have no guarantees. And this is another interesting problem. So this thing here is basically redirecting the user to the root of my application. How do I know if that is the intended purpose of this? Like, what happens if this is actually not where I need to go? What if I'm actually forgetting something? What if there needs to be something else going on in this redirect? Maybe I need to have a query parameter, maybe something like that changes on the server where we assume something about the domain that I actually need to redirect to. You see, the server is it's an unescapable part of any front-end application, because the front-end is just a representation of what the server is doing. It's just a UI that is completely depending on what the server is doing. So in this this video, we're going to have a look at this, because this is not the only problem. Another problem that can arise is that you have, say that you have an animation. say that you have a CSS animation or something like that, where you click something and it's going to transform, it's going to rotate, it's going to do something. How would you figure that out in this environment? I mean, what you could do technically is, I mean, you could, with a lot of hassle, at least from my experience, create some timers. You could maybe, if you're just using all CSS in JS, you could probably use JavaScript to figure it out somehow, but that CSS is tricky, because if there's a style sheet or anything like that, it's almost impossible for you to figure out if the transition time is correct, or if something went wrong with the animation, or like something, or have you hidden something that shouldn't be hidden? Is something covering something that isn't supposed to be covered? All of these sorts of questions that are realities of the browser are lost with component tests. You see, these tests are really, really good at one specific thing, and that is to test the state of the DOM and the logic, like the logic that achieves that state. That is what these tests are pretty much designed to do. But they have almost no ability to assert that the intended behavior or the user experience is the correct experience. And that's the thing that we're going to look at now. So, how do we solve this? Well, the way that we solve this is through a system like this. So I'm using Cypress, and basically let's run this first. So here is Cypress. It's a very nice application for testing and doing end-to-end testing, all of this good stuff. And here you can see here that I have all my tests. They're all passing. Everything looks great. So I'm going to rerun these tests. And as you can see here now in high speed, it's basically just, I don't know if you even can catch that, but we're going to just step through it a little bit. So here you can see every step of the execution that has taken place, and you can see that I made an assertion. And then we see here that we have, say, a login page where we go to the login, we find the input, we type in some stuff, and then we kind of just slowly walk our way through and make an assertion on what the expected state is going to be once that's done. This is actually where the redirect is happening. So I'm basically in the assertion just making sure that if I go to the login page, I put in my information and I hit submit, then I expect that I'm going to be redirected to the actual home page. And these sorts of tests are, they are not necessarily I mean, there are people who are writing these sorts of tests for the server as well. End-to-end testing isn't just a UI thing. But I think that although it's important to do that for the server if you're making an API or something, it is even more important that you do it when you have a UI, because these sorts of tests are perfect to simulate the user's journey and the experience that you want that user to have when they're interacting, not just with one component, but with the sequence of components. Because remember, every component, you can absolutely test each individual component, but the cooperation between them is the hard part to capture in a unit test. Because a unit test isn't designed to do that. It's designed to check that one component, that if everything it does is correctly managed, it's going to work, right? But it's more complicated than that, because you have all these interactions. And that's why you want these sorts of tests. So let's just have a bit of a look here on, let's take the home page here. So what I've done here basically is that I have created a state builder. And what a state builder is, actually no, let's start with the login page first, because that makes it even simpler. So here is my login page. This test is, all it does is, it's going to check if it should be possible to log in. So it's going to go to the login page, it's going to find the username input foo, and the password, it's going to input bar, and then it's going to hit click, and it's going to just submit it. And then we should expect ourselves to be redirected to the root homepage. That's pretty much it. And then we, of course, have a failure case as well. Now, you notice here that I'm also asserting that when I hit that submit button, that I'm not being redirected. I'm staying on the login page, but I'm also asserting that I have a paragraph element that contains login failed. And if we think back to what we were doing in the to-do list spec here, I'm pretty sure we're going to find, let's see here, no, it was maybe login failed, yes. I might be remembering this incorrectly. I could have sworn that we have that. Wasn't it to-do list? Yeah, it should be here, right? You are typing. No, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, this is for you are typing. So I just, but the principle is the same still. So this, if I had written a, I haven't done that yet. I actually forgot about that. So if I had written a test for the to-do list here, I would have made pretty much the exact same test here. I would have done the same thing for the login page test that we had here. That we have here, it would have been the same assertion, like, because it's a natural part of this test, this end-to-end test that I'm writing, right? So the thing that I'm trying to capture is that if you input incorrect information, then you shouldn't be redirected, and you should see a message that describes that, hey, something went wrong. And if you think about that, if I were to write this test for the to-do list logic that I was trying to figure out earlier, where you're going to see a message saying that you are typing, I would have asserted that as well in this test. And that's something that I think it's an important lesson to have here, because this is an overlap between two tests, if that makes sense. So you're going to test the same thing in the component test pretty much as you're going to test in the end-to-end test. And since the end-to-end test is something that you cannot escape, because you need the end-to-end test to figure out if your features are actually working in the intended manner, because the component test won't tell you that. The component test only will tell you that the component works, not that the feature is working correctly. So this is where I'm a bit on the fence. If you want to do these, like to double your test and have them both at the component layer and at the end-to-end test layer, then that's fine. It's just something that I want to illustrate to you, that the line between the assertions of what you should see on the page kind of gets blurred. It's very tricky to, in my world, to create it's very often that you find this overlap between component tests and with end-to-end tests. But enough about that. Hopefully this makes sense to you. So the second thing that we notice here is that we have a home spec, which is testing the home page. And here we have a bit of a different scenario, because in the login case, we basically are just logging into the application. Now, this depends a little bit, but when you're basically trying to test a feature that is state dependent, in other words, there is a feature here that you need to, I see I have this thing here. You have a feature that is trying to assert, you're trying to assert a feature that exists somewhere within your application logic. Now, the problem with asserting a feature that isn't literally just the login page is that you must pass the login stage. You pretty much have to get from the you have to fill in your information, get to the right page, and do the thing that you're supposed to do right. In this scenario, it's a very simple test. All it's basically checking is that, all right, I'm getting to the right page, or rather, I'm not getting to the right page if I'm not logged in. So if I try to directly go to the root, I should be redirected to the login page, and it should be possible to go to the home page. And in order to do that, I do this kind of weird thing here called builder create user, then run, and then I do this stuff here where I basically assert that I am on the correct page, right? Now, this is something that there are two ways in my world to solve this sort of problem. One way is to basically just create a reusable function of some sort, which is basically this suite here. We would create a helper function that just goes through these steps, like just recreates these steps, and then basically what we would do is that we would fill out the login form, then go to the home page, and then do the test that we're actually trying to assert on, which is that we arrive at this page, right? Now, that is a way to do it. The argument that I have against that is that that's very wasteful. It's extremely wasteful, in fact, because basically what you're doing is that there's so much duplication. Like, you have to redo these steps over and over and over. And although this can be useful, I think that it is a bit more pragmatic to try to short circuit some of that if it's possible. I mean, if you have the resources, if you know that you can run these tests in that fashion, it is the best way of doing it, because then you're actually using the same user journey that the user is going to use every time. You're not you're not in a risk of trying to create some type of scenario. You don't risk creating a scenario where you may create test code that just works, but the user journey is broken. So I will be honest, it is, if the best thing is if you can just reuse the steps, but I want to show you an alternative to doing that because it's not right for everybody. So the way that I handle that is by creating a state builder. So what is a state builder? A state builder is just a class with a few helper functions that helps me create a database state that will allow me to get to a application state that I need to be in. So in this scenario, in order for me to be able to go to the home page without needing to log in first, is that I actually have to have two things. I need to have a user and I need to have a session. These two things need to exist, otherwise I won't get into the application. So what the state builder is going to do is that it's going to have a list of commands, and then I have this function called create users, and I'm just going to define a command which is going to have a URL and some data that I want to send, and then I'm just going to push that to my list of commands, and then I return this so I can chain this. And then I have a function called clear, which is just going to do a network call to the clear endpoint on my server. And then I have a function called run that is simply going to define a bunch of results, loop through all of my commands, and just post all these commands to the server, gather up the results, clear the commands, and return those results. And this allows me to pretty much just execute. I can basically call a bunch of do a bunch of network calls to the server and create a database state that I need. So if we look at the server now, so here in my server, it's just an Express server, and as you can see here, I am using a session system like Express sessions, and I parse JSON. I have some static files that I'll upload, and I have this endpoint called /user/current. That's basically just going to check if you have it's just going to use the session and check the user ID of that session and try to find a user that is associated with this, and then just return that user. And then we have a login function here, which basically just tries to grab the user if it can find one. And then I have this special case here. This is just for demo purposes because I don't want to have to create a register page. So this is just basically making sure that if I say foo and bar, if the password and username is foo and bar, it's just going to create a user if there is none already existent, so that the first user is already created, just so I can demo things for you guys. And then we just check if there is no user, we're going to return 401, and otherwise we're just going to add the user's ID to the session. And then this is basically now, me logged in. And down here we have some in-memory to-dos because I'm lazy, and this is how we create to-dos. And then we have a logout endpoint that basically just logs out, it destroys the session, and that's it. Now the interesting part for the state builder is this part here. So if the node environment is development, which is going to be the default when we're running these tests, these things are going to be added on top. And I'm going to add the course middleware, which just allows me to do basically call it. I can run JavaScript in any browser and just do a call to the server, even though I'm not on the same domain. So just a course call basically. And then I have an endpoint called /users, where I basically blindly just take whatever the request body is. I try to create a user, and then I create a session, and then I return the user. And then I have a clear that just deletes all of the users in my database. Now these endpoints are extremely powerful. They should in no way ever be available to a user in a production environment, because they could basically, I could destroy my entire database here if I wanted to. But their intention is to allow me to create the state that I need in order to get to basically just be able to test a feature that I want to test without having to build that state up through tons and tons of clicking and interacting with the user, with the interfaces. Sometimes it's not even possible to create a user journey that will end in a specific state, because sometimes you might have certain users that need to fulfill certain requirements in order to get to a certain state of the application. But this way, I can short circuit that and create any state I want. So that's pretty much what I'm doing here. So all I'm doing is that I'm creating a user and I'm getting a session, and then I'm running my tests. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So the state builder is just a way for you to pretty much be certain that you can short circuit your application so that you don't have to go through the you don't have to repeat tons and tons and tons of steps in order to achieve this. And this, it makes it a lot faster. If I'm completely honest, like the tests run much faster if you do it this way. So lastly, I'm going to touch on this thing here. So you might be wondering, why do I have logout.spec, login spec, and then a home spec? Shouldn't the logout, like I mean this test here, these tests here, are testing the home page, and these tests here, you're just saying testing a logout, and this is just testing the login page. So what's up? Why don't I bake this in together with the home page? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, the reason why I'm not doing that is because I'm not testing on a page level. I'm testing on a feature level. So the next test, if I'm testing on a feature level, would have been for me to create a new file that is called todolist.spec.js, because the to-do list is a feature of my application. It's on the home page, but I don't care about and the home page is a feature in of itself, right? But I'm not trying to test on a page level. I want to test on a feature level. And the reason why is simply because a page may contain tons and tons and tons and tons of different features, and they may be dependent on different environments, and they may be dependent on tons of different circumstances. But by splitting it on a feature level, it's easier for me to just to have my tests focused on a user experience. Because when I test a page, I'm not, when you're testing a user journey, you don't care about the page unless the whole feature journey, the whole user journey is literally go to that page. If you're just testing out something on a page, what you're after is not the page itself, but the experience or the flow, the steps, the user journey that takes the person from the start position to the end position of that user journey. So splitting your tests in this manner makes it much easier for you to keep your tests smaller and more focused on what they're actually there to achieve. So you can see here that it's pretty much the same pattern here. I have a builder that just clears the database, and then I create a user, I run my command so that it actually fires off the function, the actual commands, and then I call done, and then I just do the logout. So I haven't added any tests right now for this for this demo of mine for when dealing with animations and stuff of this nature. But I hope that you can see the value in these sorts of tests, because what they do is that they actually capture the actual experience of the user working with your application, which is extremely, I would even go as far as to say it's almost impossible to do that effectively with just component level testing. So hopefully you have, with these two videos of mine, understood that there's in front end two ways of testing something. You can do component testing, and you can do user experience testing or end-to-end testing. Both of these you will need in order to assert that your components are working in the correct fashion and you have a high confidence in your components, so that you feel that you're confident in making changes and that they don't break or things of this nature. And the other part of it is that you have a user journey that is as close as what the user is actually going to experience with the live system as possible, that guarantees you that if you ship this, if this login spec, if this is running, then all of the interactions that a user could take in this fashion will work with the actual live system. So hopefully this has taught you something about testing and a few of the ideas that I have regarding that. Have a great day.